Hello, I just played a Teleman Fantasia in G major, which is taken out of a very important collection for the flute, the 12 Fantasias, so known as the Teleman Fantasias for solo flute. I would like to put this collection a little bit in context. First of all, as you noticed, I played it on a Baroque flute, so a flute as it was used and known in the beginning of the 18th century. I will talk a little bit later about this type of flute and a little bit to explain what was the situation of the transverse flute in Germany in the beginning of the 18th century. These pieces were composed by Teleman and published in 1732 or 33. We are not so sure about the exact date, but it is about when we suppose that they were published, so 1733. In this time, there was not yet so much music for the transverse flute because it was indeed considered a very new instrument. It had been developed in France in the last years of the 17th century and introduced in Germany by French players who emigrated to Germany, so for work reasons, sometimes also for religion reasons. They went to Germany and they introduced some new instruments which had been developed in France according to the last standards. And that was the case of the transverse flute. In Germany, it was mostly the recorder, which was known and used in instrumental music as well as cantatas. So it means that before 1710, there was almost no transverse flute in German music. And from 1710, in the next decades, the traverso, the transverse flute, developed quite a lot. And therefore, there was an increasing need of music for this instrument. In the beginning, as the famous Quantz was stating, in the first years, there was not enough music, so flute players had often to either write themselves the music they wanted to play or transcribe some violin sonatas. Telemann contributed significantly to the repertoire and wrote a lot of pieces. But it's important to understand that these fantasias belong to some of the earliest pieces for the transverse flute. So, well, of course, let's talk a little bit about the instrument. You might be a little bit more used to consider this instrument as the flute, which is, of course, the latest development as we play it in the orchestra. But the instrument in the 18th century was actually a lot more simple. And I might even show what the French introduced in the early years of the 18th century, which was, this is another type of instrument. So you can see it is made of 3 parts. So we have the head joint with the embouchure, the body, and what we call the foot, with only one single key and 6 holes, and of course the hole for the embouchure. A little bit later, the makers in Germany, as well as in France and in the other countries, started to divide the flute in 4 parts. So the purpose of the 4 parts might be, first of all, to make it fit in the smaller bags or fit in the pockets, but I think this is a secondary reason. One of the reasons for that might be that the middle, what we call the left-hand joint here, could be made in several lengths and to allow to change the pitch of the instrument. And here I can show you additional left-hand joints of different lengths. If I take them apart, you will see that we have, so from the biggest to the smallest, sometimes there were even more, which allows to play in different pitch. The lowest pitch we have is an entire tone lower than the modern pitch. Here is the A, which was very favorite pitch in the early 18th century, which was liked because it's very warm and deep. And for comparison, we'll show you the modern pitch. That's the A as well nowadays. So don't be surprised, because for most of the examples I'm going to show on the flute pitched almost a tone lower. So we have a pitch which is now 392 Hertz. With the smallest joint, it's a half tone higher. And the intermediary joint, which is my favorite for now and the one I will use for showing the examples. And that's a D major. So if in case you have perfect pitch, it will take a little while to adapt to that. But this is also a very pleasant pitch to play because it sounds warm, round, and at the same time it is dynamic. Why did the makers make some corps de rechange, so alternate joints for the left hand? It was because the pitch was not stabilized in the 18th century, and therefore if the players would travel from one city to another, they had to face a different height of pitch. And thanks to that, they could adapt and choose the part of the flute which would allow them to join the band. And sometimes within the same city, according to whether you played at court or if you played in the church, it was also a different level that was used. So that was normal musical life in the 18th century. Another important thing is, of course, the flute is made of wood, needless to say, but also it is a conical bore, contrary to the modern flute, which has a cylindrical bore, and so it is wider near the embouchure and, as you can observe, much thinner on the end of the flute near the joint. Now, let's talk about the music and the 12 fantasias for flute. They are well known nowadays and one of the few masterpieces of the Baroque era that is played by every flute player and that we learn quite early in our musical life. The first thing that I have to point is that fantasia doesn't mean to play with fantasy and to play without respecting the rhythm or the speed or the right tempo. Fantasia means that the structure of the piece is free. And in fact, each of the pieces of the 12 fantasias will have a different structure. They don't follow the same model, the same pattern, like 3 movements or 4 movements. This is where the title comes from. And this is also to warn from the temptation that we have sometimes to be playing with too much freedom. Of course, we can have some freedom, but it doesn't mean that we can change the tempo in each bar, that the 8 notes would equal the quarter notes in the next bar, and so on. It's very important to keep an inner sensation of the tempo and of the structure. What I find really fascinating with these 12 fantasias, which I consider to be really masterpieces, is that Telemann seems to have had the ambition to do a collection that represents all the music of his time and to also try to bring the flute, the new transverse flute, to the extreme of its possibilities, and sometimes even to extend beyond its possibilities through his art. First of all, what is very interesting is that they will explore nearly every key that the flute can play with ease. And it's not the case of another collection of fantasias like the one for the 12 fantasias for violin, for example. They are not so systematic in the organization of the key. Another very interesting point is that Telemann seems to have the ambition to use the instrument with the smallest possibilities. Because if you think about it, compared to a keyboard, we cannot play chords. Compared to the violin, we have a much smaller range. We cannot go as low and we cannot go as high. And we cannot play double stops. But Telemann seems to want to pretend that we can. And that's a very interesting point. First of all, if we look at all the pieces in these fantasias, it seems that he wants to represent all the music of his time. Not only solo flute music, but thanks to his art and to the power of imagination, he can make people who listen and who play imagine that they play orchestra music or organ music or dance music or even opera music. Of course, we need to give a lot of space to imagination. But let's have a look. We have, for example, orchestra music. If you take Fantasia number 7, there is an ouverture alla francese. With the typical dotted rhythms. And the middle part. And with a fugato. We have also an example of Italian concerto grosso, where we can also, if we let all its place to imagination, we can listen to the tutti orchestra and a solo violin which improvise in between. Soloist. Tutti. Solo. And so on. So already Italian Concerto Grosso in the Corelli style and Ouverture à la Française in the Lully style. Then we have also all the palette of the dances, because dance music was very important, and even all the suites for instruments, you would find all the catalog of dances. And let's look at them. We have, for example, the courante in Fantasia number 10. And if I want to introduce all these dances, because Telemann will almost never name them, he just writes presto, allegro, andante, a tempo giusto. And it's also a kind of game that we have to recognize the dance which is hiding behind it. So, corrente or courante. Or gavotte. We have a sarabande in the Fantasia in E major. We have a rigodon in the same sarabande, in the same Fantasia. A bourrée in the 12th Fantasia. A canary, a fast and light and jumping dance in Fantasia number 5. That we can recognize with its light dotted rhythms. We can also find Polonaise in Fantasia number 3, for example. In Fantasia number 8, sorry, I'm getting lost. Yes, number 8, here it is. Or a jig. And so on. We have also a menuet in Fantasia number 1. And even an attempt for a passacaglia or chaconne, which is hiding well. It's only 2 bars of it in Fantasia number 3. Where we clearly hear the but as always, Telemann is an expert in hiding it. This is for the dance music, but we can also observe that he will borrow to the keyboard language. And 2 of the most striking examples are Fantasia number 1, where we can recognize a toccata and fugue. If you think of Bach's famous toccatas and fugues, for example, you will recognize a little bit the same organization with some kind of free, very fast part where the organ will also exercise his fingers, and then a very formal fugue. And the fugue. Isn't it amazing that Telemann actually dares to write a fugue for a solo flute? In another Fantasia, which we will talk about later, he even writes a fugue in 3 voice, or at least an attempt of a fugue in 3 voice, which of course the flute would not be the proper instrument for it, being able to play only 1 part at a time, but he will suggest that we do play 2 or 3 parts at a time. That's his art. In number 5, we actually have also kind of preludium and fugue. And the fugue. And so on. Or we can also mention some borrowings from the opera style with movements which are less formal as instrumental movements, but probably evocate some opera arias. And so on. Of course, you might think that these big intervals are not representative of an opera aria, but actually, if you let your imagination take apart the low voice and the upper voice, that's a suggestion for Telemann to write music for 2 voices at the same time, with just broken arpeggios. And actually the ear can decide to focus on the upper voice or the lower one and hear a melody with accompaniment. So that was a little overview of the Fantasias, which will close our first episode about Telemann Fantasias. And in the second episode, we will focus on 4 movements and find a few tricks as to practice, to read and to understand them.